I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we will continue our reading of The Fairacre Festival by Miss Reed. The Fairacre Church has received massive damage to its roof from a recent storm, and they have decided to organize a festival to pay for the repairs. And they are currently discussing what should happen at the festival. "The only thing is," said Basil Bradley, warming to his theme in the midst of such general approval, "it is hardly worth setting up all the paraphernalia for less than a week. Do you think we can expect enough support?" "Why not?" said Mr. Maughan. "We'll advertise it well. People can bring parties from miles away. They're much more likely to come if they know it will be inside the building." "Oh, I do agree," his wife said firmly. "What with gnats and the wind, not to mention the odd thunderstorm, outdoor evenings are more of a penance than a pleasure." It was at last agreed that the sans-lumière arrangements would be for every evening of the festival week, and would in fact be the major part of the whole project, which would take place in July. "And do you really think we shall cover our expenses?" persisted Mrs. Maughan. "There will be no expenses," said Basil Bradley. "My friend John is giving his services, and the electrician's bills, and so on, will be my own contribution to the fund." "That's uncommonly generous," repeated the vicar. "A really wonderful gesture. I am sure we are most deeply grateful." And with this we all concurred. Major Gunning cleared his throat so martially that we all jumped to attention, or as nearly as we could in a sitting posture. "I've taken the liberty of speaking to a young cousin of mine, by way of being a singer. You may have heard of her, Jean Cole." "Jean Cole?" exclaimed Mrs. Maughan, looking at Major Gunning with new respect. "Jean Cole?" echoed Basil Bradley, turning pink with excitement. "I'd no idea she was related to you. The most beautiful contralto voice in existence today. She was superb in Aida at Covent Garden last year." "I have all her records," said the vicar. "The Bach arias are my particular favorites." Major Gunning bowed his head politely in acknowledgment of the adulation, but his tobacco-stained fingers drummed on the edge of the table, showing his impatience. "Yes, well, top and bottom of it is she would be willing to give us a tune." Basil Bradley winced. "To come here, to Fairacre?" breathed Mrs. Maughan incredulously. "As I was saying," continued Major Gunning with a touch of asperity, "Jean said that she could come and sing in the church during or after the sans-lumière performance, if it would help. Not the Monday, though. She's flying back from Berlin that day after a tour." There were delighted cries from the company. The vicar broached the delicate subject which was in all our minds. "It is indeed a most generous offer. It would mean a great deal to our efforts. But your cousin is much in demand. We must offer her some recompense for the honor she is doing us. Can we—" "She'll come," said the Major briefly, "for nothing. I'll see to that." If this sounded a trifle ominous, it was soon forgotten in the general delight. "It's too good to be true," cried Mrs. Maughan. "The most encouraging news of the evening." And with that we all agreed. The rest of the program was settled provisionally. The sans-lumière would take place after dark each evening, beginning about 9. The festival would begin with a splendid service in the church on the Sunday, at which the bishop had promised to come and bless our endeavors. "And all denominations in the area will be invited," said the vicar. "Bet they don't all come," whispered Mr. Roberts to me in a horribly penetrating whisper. "They will be invited," repeated the vicar reprovingly. Various functions would take place during the week, a mammoth jumble sale, a gargantuan whist drive, and so on, organized by various bodies in the village, and the week would culminate in a magnificent fete in the vicarage garden on Saturday afternoon, to be opened by someone who would be a real draw, as Mr. Willett said, followed by a dance in the evening. "Shall we have enough going on to warrant a whole week?" asked Mr. Willett doubtfully. "The sans-lumière will be the main thread," explained the vicar, "and our other festivities will be hung like jewels, as it were, upon this chain." "Very nicely put," commented Mr. Maughan, a trifle dryly. "Yes, it turned out rather more poetically than I had intended," replied the vicar, rather surprised and pleased with his flight of fancy. "I really should make a note of it for a future sermon." By this time, the hands of the clock stood at 10 o'clock. I went into the kitchen to prepare coffee, and the meeting ended with much animation and hope on the part of the Fairacre Festival Committee before they set off to face the wintry night. Chapter 4. "No, I never." "Yes, you did then." "I never, I tell you, I never done it." "We knows you done it all right, don't us?" A chorus of self-righteous voices greeted this ungrammatical exchange, which floated through the schoolroom window one bright morning. Sometimes I wonder why I trouble to correct the children in the classroom, knowing full well they will relapse into their mother tongue as soon as they escape from my clutches. The accused appeared to be Joseph Coggs. I could recognize his hoarse, husky croak easily above the manifold sounds from the playground. He is fairly popular with the other children, who do not seem to be bothered by his poor clothes and his gypsy background. What he had done to deserve their united attack, I was soon to know. "'Twas there all right yesterday," said one belligerently. "Funny you having a wooden dagger the same evening," shouted another mockingly. "My cousin from Caxley give it to me," growled Joseph. "He got it off some kid up the street. Likely in it." "What, same color and all?" Voices grew shriller, and I was half a mind to leave my marking to investigate when I heard Mr. Willett's hearty voice. "What's going on, then?" A dozen voices clamored together, and the gist of the story was that the hand of the clock had vanished from the appeal fund, and Joseph Coggs had been and pinched it. "You want to watch your tongues," announced Mr. Willett sternly, "and stop picking on Joe. I took the hand away, if you must know, to put another coat of paint on it. Put that in your pipes and smoke it, you young know-alls." His heavy footsteps passed on, leaving an uneasy silence. "See?" cried Joseph triumphantly. "Well, how was we to know?" muttered one of the crowd. "Your dagger was the spitting image of that hand." "Always on us to look out for folk breaking the law," grumbled another, "and what thanks do we get for trying?" "Come on up the coke heap," shouted someone cheerfully. "The bell will be going before we've had a game." And the drama ended in a wild confusion of yells and scrunching coke, enjoyed by accusers and accused alike. The hand of the clock, which had been the cause of this fracas, was moving far too slowly toward the target for Fairacre's peace of mind. The most dramatic leap forward in these last months had been caused by an anonymous gift of £100. Naturally, rumors as to the identity of this generous benefactor were legion. "I wouldn't put it past the vicar himself," said one. "Or Mr. Maughan?" queried another. "That'll be the day," said Mrs. Pringle sourly when she heard this suggestion. "Them Maughans don't part with money that easy. Best end of neck served up as chops in their house, so my niece Minnie tells me." One of the infants thought it might be a fairy. This pretty fancy was soon dispelled by the realists, who were slightly older. "Don't talk soft," implored her brother Ernest, shamed before his fellows in the playground. "No such thing as fairies," added Patrick scornfully. "And if there was, how'd you think they'd lug £100 up to the vicar's? They ain't no bigger'n my thumb." This irrefutable argument settled the matter in this instance, but the anonymous donor still remained a fascinating mystery. It was one which was never solved. Even more exciting than the anonymous gift was that Peter Martin, the pop star and idol of the young, had agreed to open the fete on the Saturday and to sing at the dance in the evening, accompanying himself on his famous guitar. He was going to prove a tremendous draw. "The weather won't really matter," said the vicar. "People will come from miles around just to see him. A very personable young fellow, I believe." Mrs. Pringle's niece Minnie expressed the general reaction to the news. "Ain't it just wonderful? We'll be breathing the very same air. To think of him coming to this place. All Caxley'll be there. You ever see him, miss?" I said I had not had the pleasure yet. "Beautiful hair he's got, long and that, all thick down to his shoulders, and his clothes cost a fortune, and he don't drink nothing but champagne." She sighed ecstatically. A visitation from the entire heavenly host, I thought somewhat tartly to myself, could not occasion more reverent adoration than this one glamorous star. Nevertheless, I too rejoiced. Think of how it would swell the funds. Work on the roof progressed steadily, and the sound of hammers and saws formed the background to our own school activities. These included, now in the last weeks of spring term, preparations for the entertainment which was to be our contribution to the Fairacre Festival. Only teachers who have dealt with these affairs can truly assess the heartburnings and headaches which accompany something which the outsider considers a simple or even a pleasurable undertaking. The only other member of the staff is the infants teacher. For years, Miss Clare, now retired and living at Beech Green, ruled the infants, and most of the adults in the village learned to read, write, and calculate under her benevolent eye. Miss Gray followed Miss Clare, but left to marry our neighboring schoolmaster, Mr. Annett, who also acts as choir master and organist at Fairacre. Then came Miss Jackson, a stormy young woman straight from college, whose departure I viewed with relief. Since then, we have had a succession of supply teachers, some good, some ghastly. But for the last year, the infants have been in charge of Mrs. Bonney, a buxom widow who manages them very well. All goes swimmingly if she is able to work in her own way, and I interfere as little as possible. Unfortunately, any sort of mild suggestion throws the lady into a defensive and resentful mood, as if one were casting a slur on her abilities. Coming to an amicable arrangement about the concert was an operation fraught with hazard, I found. My first idea of a play in which the whole school could take part fell upon stony ground. "Why can't the babies sing their nursery rhymes?" demanded Mrs. Bonney plaintively. "I've spent hours teaching them, and their mothers would love to hear them." Both facts were true. The daily chorus, one might be forgiven for saying caterwauling, had penetrated the partition between our classrooms with painful clarity, and the mothers of these young choirsters would dote on Mrs. Bonney's efforts with them. I agreed resignedly. "But nursery rhymes won't take very long," I said, trying not to sound too relieved. "We'd better have some other items." Mrs. Bonney promised to consider the matter, and within 2 days the floorboards of the infants' room were reverberating with one of those galumphing folk dances from mid-Europe which involve much clapping and stamping. The clapping and stamping are no doubt performed in unison in the country of the dance's origin, but certainly not in the Fairacre infants' room. Next door, we were sorely tried. It was almost a relief to return to the nursery rhymes and to listen wincing to "Hickory dickory dock, the mouse run up the clock. The clock struck 1, the mouse run down." Here would follow a succession of claps as each child took its time to register the need for action, and then triumphantly they would bellow, "Hickory dickory dock." Mrs. Bonney would then praise them loudly, point out the aspirate at the beginning of hickory, and the necessity of singing ran instead of run, and the same thing would be repeated ad nauseum. Our own efforts were little better. I had dramatized The Princess and the Swineherd, which gave everyone a chance of appearing on the stage, and doubted if the words would ever be learnt. Ernest, the only possible swineherd cum prince, became so sheepish about performing a courtly bow that I threatened to demote him to a courtier, although we both knew that there was no one else really capable of taking the part. Sometimes I despaired of ever getting Fairacre School to take part in the festival, and wondered gloomily if the sale of Queen Anne's chalice might not, after all, be a better way of raising the money. I did not, of course, voice these treasonous sentiments, but Mr. Lamb, our village postmaster, spoke about it when I went to buy the school's saving stamps one afternoon some weeks later. "Of course, it's not plain sailing, this selling the church silver. Has to be a faculty or something, the vicar tells me. A lot of chit-chat goes on, evidently, before permission's given. I can't see us being allowed to part with it. And to tell the truth, I don't think anyone in Fairacre wants to see it go." He handed me the stamps, and with them 3 or 4 photographs in color. "Your brother's family?" I asked, looking at them. Mr. Lamb's brother George left Fairacre for New York after the war and runs a catering business there. He left before I took over the school, but regularly corresponds with our Mr. Lamb, who shows us the photographs and tells us all about his brother's successes when we visit the post office. He is very proud indeed of this younger brother, now the father of 3 husky boys who beamed from the photographs. Just a chance he may be over, said Mr. Lamb, taking back the photographs and inserting them carefully into his wallet. Some business trip, he says. They're chartering a plane, it seems, if he can manage it. He'll be over here for a fortnight. This was good news. I sauntered down the village street, enjoying the sunshine, and hoped for Mr. Lamb's sake that his brother would be able to return to Fairacre. It was my guess that he would not find it much changed, even though he had been absent now for over 20 years. The question of the sale of the chalice was in everyone's mind. None worried quite as deeply as the vicar. He woke on these bright summer mornings to the chorus of the birds in his garden, and then, after the first few moments of pleasure, the familiar little cloud cooled the sunshine of his waking moments and was with him for the rest of the day. He refused to do anything about negotiations for the sale of the precious chalice. He steadfastly hoped and prayed that enough would be raised by the festival, and that this step, so repugnant to him, might never be necessary. Mr. Maughan did his best to make his friend change his mind, but he remained obdurate. I refuse to discuss it, said the vicar one evening, pink with rare impatience. But my dear Gerald, you simply can't bury your head in the sand like an ostrich. At least find out the facts. Let's see if we can try for permission. Time's running out, you know. The bills are going to be pretty formidable. And can you honestly believe that the festival will raise enough to pay them? I have no doubt that the Lord will provide, repeated the vicar stubbornly. His friend raised his eyebrows, looked helplessly at Mrs. Partridge, but forbore to reply. The chalice had last been used at Whitsun, and not one touching the ancient mellow silver and gazing into its gleaming depths failed to feel a pang. Would this be the last time that Fairacre's treasure with its blessed contents would be offered to them? The service was a paean of praise. Red and white roses nodded on the altar. Sunshine poured through the windows, gilding the arum lilies at the chancel steps. Country voices had made the glittering brass vibrate with Whitsun hymns, and Mr. Annett at the organ had pulled out all the stops and flooded the church with mighty splendor. The thought of the possible loss of the chalice was the one touch of frost among the bursting glory of Whitsunday. As the festival drew closer, our fears for the chalice became sharper. Somehow we simply must make the festival a success, we told each other. We did not say in so many words that Queen Anne's chalice was at stake, but the unspoken thought was constantly with us. It was Mrs. Pringle, usually the harbinger of doom, who brought a rare touch of comfort to Mr. Partridge, the vicar, at about this time. He had called at the school with a list of hymns which he hoped I would teach the children, when Mrs. Pringle clattered in, bearing a battered pail in one hand and a scrubbing brush in the other. "Bit late leaving, ain't you?" she remarked sourly. "Clock wrong, then? I was going to give the lobby a scrub out, but it's no use going it till the children are cleared off. Love's labor's lost, that'd be." The vicar, who is used to this sort of thing, smiled benignly. "You're going to have a church full on Tuesday, then. You was lucky to get that Miss Cole to sing," she continued conversationally, setting down the bucket with a clang. "My sister's girl, what works at the coach station in Caxley, says there's 3 coachloads booked already to come over." The vicar's smile grew wider. "What splendid news, Mrs. Pringle. And no end of women's institutes have rung up about it, and the Mothers' Union and some young farmers." "A really wide audience," commented the vicar rapturously. "Takes all sorts to make a world," conceded Mrs. Pringle graciously, "but it do look hopeful, I must say." "It does indeed," replied the vicar, gazing affectionately on my school cleaner. "It does indeed." She bent to pick up the bucket and then took up her customary militant stance. "Well," she demanded, with a return to her usual truculence, "do them children go now or not? This here water's getting cold." "I'll send them through the other way," I said meekly. "We won't hold up your scrubbing any longer." This was no time for petty warfare, I felt. Mrs. Pringle, messenger of hope, should have her way. Chapter 5. The posters were up everywhere in the countryside. They blazed from barn doors, from gate posts, from tree trunks, and in the windows of many a village shop. One made a bright blue corner on the appeals board. Across the village street, between the Beetle and Wedge and the Emery's house, a banner fluttered bearing the words, Fairacre Festival, July 9th through 15th. Bunting was draped across our house fronts, and those of us who owned a flag had it in readiness to hoist on the Sunday, which was to be the first day of the festival. The cross of St. George, freshly laundered by Mrs. Willett, would soon be flaunting itself above the church spire, upon which the regilded weathercock perched again. Inside the church, the electricians were putting the final touches on the wiring and lighting. Jock Graham, the retired architect who had so nobly offered his services, became extremely agitated by the ladders lodged among the timbers of the hammer beam roof. He was unduly sharp with Mr. Maughan, who had dropped in one morning to see how things were progressing. "I'll not be responsible," he rumbled, rolling his R's in Doric splendor, "for any damages to that historic roof. A lot of tomfoolery to rig up lights so near the timbers. Those men have no idea of the pricelessness of the work around them." "Oh, come now," protested Mr. Maughan. "They're used to this sort of thing. I believe they were employed at Winchester Cathedral, or was it Salisbury?" "It wouldn't be allowed in Scotland," Mr. Graham assured him. "That I can well imagine," remarked his companion dryly. The hint of sarcasm inflamed Jock Graham still further. "A decent God-fearing kirk would be ashamed to turn itself into something no better than a theatre. I'd no idea when I offered my services that this sort of thing would be countenanced." "I see nothing offensive about it," retorted Mr. Maughan. "It is an act of praise." "It's commercial," boomed Mr. Graham, his sandy eyebrows bristling. "It wouldn't happen in Scotland, I tell you." "I really can't think," replied Mr. Maughan with maddening detachment, "why so many of you Scotsmen bother to come south if you dislike it so much. Personally, I'm all for Scottish nationalism, and I'd rebuild Hadrian's Wall for good measure once I got all you immigrants back on the right side of it." "You'd get no far without stiffening a good Scots blood among you," thundered Jock Graham. "A weakly, unprincipled set of shilly-shalliers, lacking purpose and integrity." The workmen high above had ceased their labors and were watching this passage of arms with intense interest. The two men faced each other. Mr. Maughan's pale face wore a supercilious smile, and Mr. Graham's, suffused to an unbecoming shade of purple, was thrust close to his antagonists. At this dramatic moment, Basil Bradley arrived on the scene. "I can't tell you how relieved I am that I've already recorded the script," he croaked huskily. "My tonsils are absolutely aflame. I can't think why I've succumbed so easily at this time of year. I swear by orange juice for breakfast, nothing more, just fresh orange juice." "You do better on a braw fresh herring and a plate of salted porridge," thundered Jock Graham. He brushed past the two men and marched head erect down the aisle to the west door. "Whatever's gotten into him?" asked Basil Bradley, bewildered. "Scotch blood," said Mr. Maughan cryptically. "Scotland forever. I mean, Scotland for aye." "Oh dear," croaked Basil Bradley, extracting a small tin from his pocket. "Oh, well, it makes one quite glad to have been born in humble Bayswater, doesn't it? Have a blackcurrant lozenge, Henry." So we'll see how international relations proceed at the Fairacre Festival next time.